Truckers, Part 33. Chapter 14. From the Book of Gnome, Exits. Chapter 4, verses 15 to 16. 15. And the gnomes said, "Here is a new place, to be ours for ever and ever." 16. And the outsider said nothing. It had been a quarry. The gnomes knew this because the gate had a rusty sign on it. Quarry. Dangerous. Do not enter. They found it after a mad panicking run across the fields. By luck, if you listen to Angelo, because of Arnold Brothers established 1905, if you believed Gerda. It doesn't matter how they settled in, found the few old tumble-down buildings, explored the caves and rock heaps, cleared out the rats. That wasn't too difficult. The harder part was persuading most of the older gnomes to go outside. They felt happier with a floor over their heads. Granny Morky came in useful there. She made them watch her walk up and down outside, braving the terrible, fresh air. Besides, the food taken from the store didn't last forever. There was hunger, and there were rabbits in the fields above. Vegetables, too. Not nice and clean, of course, as Arnold Brothers established 1905 had intended they should be, but just sticking in the ground, covered with dirt. There were complaints about this. The molehills that appeared in a nearby field were simply the result of the first experimental potato mine. After a couple of nasty experiences, foxes learned to keep away. And then there was Dorcas's discovery of electricity, still in wires, leading to a box in one of the deserted sheds. Getting at it while staying alive seemed to need nearly as much planning as the Great Drive, with a lot of broom handles and rubber gloves involved. After a lot of thought, Masklin had pushed the thing near one of the electric wires. It had flashed a few lights, but had kept silent. He felt it was listening. He could hear it listening. He'd taken it away again and tucked it into a gap in one of the walls. He had an obscure feeling that it wasn't time to use the thing again yet. The longer they left it, he thought, the longer they'd have to work out for themselves what it was they were doing. He'd like to wake up later and say, "Look, this is what we've done, all by ourselves." Gerda had already worked out they were probably somewhere in China. And so the winter became spring, and spring became summer. But it wasn't finished, Masklin felt. He sat on the rocks above the quarry, on guard. They always kept a guard on duty, just in case. One of Dorcas's inventions, a switch which was connected to a wire which would light a bulb down under one of the sheds, was hidden under a stone by his side. He'd been promised radio one of these days. One of these days might be quite soon, because Dorcas had pupils now. They seemed to spend a lot of time in one of the tumble-down sheds, surrounded by bits of wire and looking very serious. Guard duty was quite popular, at least on sunny days. This was home now. The gnomes were settling in, filling the corners, planning, spreading out, starting to belong. Especially Bobo. He'd disappeared on the first day and turned up again, scruffy and proud, as the leader of the quarry rats and the father of a lot of little ratlings. Perhaps it was because of this that the rats and the gnomes seemed to be getting along okay, politely avoiding each other whenever possible, and not eating one another. They belong here more than we do, thought Masklin. This isn't really our place. This belongs to humans. They've just forgotten about it for a while, but one day they'll remember it. They'll come back here and we'll have to move on. We'll always have to move on. We'll always try to create our own little worlds inside the big world. We used to have it all, and now we think we're lucky to have a little bit. He looked down at the quarry below him. He could just make out Grimmer sitting in the sun with some of the young gnomes, teaching them to read. That was a good thing anyway. He'd never be that good at it, but the kids seemed to pick it up easily enough. But there were still problems. The departmental families, for example. They had no departments to rule and spent a lot of time squabbling. There seemed to be arguments going on the whole time, and everyone expected him to sort them out. It seemed the only time gnomes acted together was when they had something to occupy their minds. "Beyond the moon," the thing had said. "You used to live in the stars." Masklin lay back and listened to the bees. "One day we'll go back. We'll find a way to get to the big ship in the sky, and we'll go back. But not yet. It would take some doing, and the hard part again will be getting people to understand. Every time we climb up a step and settle down and think we've got to the top of the stairs and start bickering about things. Still, even knowing that the stairs are there is a pretty good start. From here he could see for miles across the countryside. For instance, he could see the airport. It had been quite frightening the day they'd seen the first jet go over. But a few of the gnomes had recalled pictures from books they'd read, and it turned out to be nothing more than a sort of lorry built to drive in the sky. Masklin hadn't told anyone why he thought that knowing more about the airport would be a good idea. Some of the others suspected, he knew, but there was so much to do that they weren't thinking about it now. He'd led up to it carefully. He'd just said that it was important to find out as much about this new world as possible, just in case. He'd put it in such a way that no one had said, "In case of what?" And anyway, there were people to spare and the weather was good. He'd led a team of gnomes across the fields to it. It had been a week's journey, but there were 30 of them and there had been no problems. They'd even had to cross a motorway, but they'd found a tunnel built for badgers and a badger coming along it when it turned the other way round and hurried off when they approached. Bad news, like armed gnomes, spreads quickly. And then they'd found the wire fence and climbed up it a little way and spent hours watching the planes landing and taking off. Masklin had felt, just as he had done once or twice before, that here was something very important. The jets looked big and terrible, but once he'd thought that about lorries. You just had to know about them. Once you had the name, you had something you could handle, like a sort of lever. One day, they could be useful. One day, the gnomes might need them to take another step. Funnily enough, he felt quite optimistic about it. He'd had one glorious moment of feeling that, although they argued and bickered and got things wrong and tripped over themselves, gnomes would come through in the end. Because Dorcas had been watching the planes too, clinging to the wire with a calculating look in his eyes. And Masklin had said, "Just supposing, for the sake of argument, you understand, we need to steal one of those. Do you think it could be done?" And Dorcas had rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Shouldn't be too hard to drive," he said, and grinned. "They've only got 3 wheels. The end.